Hello, my name is David Mitchell. I'm a professor of English at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., United States. And this talk is called Indigenous Resistance Literatures, Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, which was published in 1977 and has been a very influential text by an Indigenous writer about the long history of colonialism and settler colonialism experienced by Native Americans in the US. Partially, what I want to do here is I want to draw attention to the use of what I'm going to call disability in the text, which is a sense of bodies coming in variations. Some of those variations are depreciated or pathologized culturally. Native Americans have withstood a long history of European disease and ill health due to impoverishment and being banished to reservations that have insufficient arable land on them. And I wanted to think about these issues in relationship to Silko's novel Ceremony. She wrote the novel in Seattle, Washington, although she's from the Lakota Reservation, which is in New Mexico. And so let me get started. The introduction, the longue durée of global dispossession. This essay analyzes the fraught relationship between representations of disability and the precarity born of processes of global colonialism. To undertake this project, I analyzed representations of disability in Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony. Silko's work reaches back from its contemporary settings in the late 1940s to exhume myriad past violence wrought by European conquests, the continuing effects of colonialism in the Americas, and its attendant genocidal impacts. Taken individually and as a literary tradition, works of resistance literature offer creative reimaginings of first contact with European colonizers and seek to archaeologically unearth the ruins of history, the incomplete erasure of Indigenous practices, cultures, and lives. And one of the things that Barbara Harlow, who's one of the theorists of resistance literature, argues that there's no such thing as a complete erasure. That colonialism involves the absorption of the colonized culture into its matrices, although it seeks to disguise their presence there. Our analysis of disability precarity in the novel endeavors to show how the remnants of historical dispossession have shattered Indigenous lives, impaired the health of colonized populations, brought death-dealing practices to previously sustainable Indigenous communities, and threatened to destroy the world for even present-day survivors of various colonial projects. This chapter's centering term precarity takes up Judith Butler's theorization by examining details of what constitutes the conditions of precarity and in turn applying them to Indigenous populations. Let's switch my slide here. So there's a picture of the first edition of Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony. Take a look at. And here are some of the aspects and characteristics of Barbara Harlow's resistance literature that I'm going to cover as appearing in the novel and helps us situate the novel as an act of resistance literature. But for now, let me take up Judith Butler's theorization of precarity. So this chapter centering term precarity takes up Judith Butler's theorization by examining details of what constitutes the conditions of precarity and in turn applying them to indigenous cultures. My goal here is to map some ways in which disability serves as an alternative ethical map of living in works of indigeneity opposed to the imposition of Euro-American sovereignty. Like many works, Ceremony was written by an indigenous writer, Leslie Marmon Silko, of Sioux Lakota origins, and her novel draws heavily from historical archives, still surfacing in the longue durée of indigenous experiences. By using the term precarity, Butler calls forth, quote, insight on injury, namely that there are others out there on whom my life depends. This defining fundamental interdependency of all embodied beings often reveals the tragic irony that there are ways of distributing vulnerability through differential forms of allocation that make some populations more subject to arbitrary violence than others. In this keynote talk, I use the phrase peripheral embodiment as an imposition of inferiority on indigenous and/or disabled people by hierarchical systems of the human perpetuated under colonial and post-colonial rule. The key bridge between these two terms, indigeneity and disability, form the nexus of the depreciations of primitivism and its incumbent concept of inbuilt biological incapacity that mutually disqualify the original inhabitants of a colonized space. Disability under the imposition of colonialism on indigenous people offers up insights on both ends of Butler's key formulation. First, disability represents a key aspect of the precarity of vulnerability that disrupts models of normative self-sufficiency characteristic of colonial mindsets and acts as foundational to conditions of racism, ableism, predicated on the belief that indelible marks of inferior or unworthy ancestry prove non-transcendable. If the racism occurring under Western eyes invests itself in false explanatory models of primitive inferiority and therefore justifies the governance of indigenous lives, then disability precarity devalued inbuilt biological characteristics of sensory, cognitive, psychiatric, and physical differences serves as a non-normative pathway to alternative worlds that actively resist such binary justifications of power. So that's my opening and overview of the argument that I want to make. The first section is called Colonialism's Rapacious Bodily Intimacies. The impact of environmental toxicity from colonial contact in Silko's novel Ceremony reaches back into the longue durée of dispossessions from Central and South American tribal communities begun by the Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century. And I'm borrowing the term longue durée there from Francois Braudel, the French historian who argued that there was no way to understand civilizations by taking up a kind of moment in their experience, whether that be military conquest, settler colonialism, or whatever. One had to reach back into the centuries in order to follow the development over time. And that's what these novels of resistance literature do, I'm arguing. The novel charts the return of U.S. World War II veteran Teo and his experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after repeated exposures to weapons-based toxicities, uninhabitable conditions on a, quote, nameless Pacific Island prisoner of war camp. the death of his Native American half-brother Rocky, and military carnage from the clash of Japanese and US military in the Pacific Rim. In addition to this experience of bodily trauma in irradiated militarized environments, Teo also finds himself abandoned by the promised military and social support systems for wounded, disabled veterans returning home. On the opening pages of the novel, Teo awakes in a tangle of voices that intertwine Spanish, Japanese, and Laguna in a mesh of sources, traditions, and influences from which we must draw for survival. The precarity of Teo's situation is also a product of an archival overlay of meanings that enmesh themselves in an impassable underbrush of words that cannot be easily teased out or separated. Thus, from the opening pages, Teo's disabling condition is as much a product of understanding intertwined historical forces and the meaning of enmeshed traditions, the overriding of Laguna teachings and practices by European and Asian Pacific belief systems, which he struggles to untangle. This web of contradictory traditions function as akin to the historical rampage of an epidemic of unknown origins that Teo experiences through a brief vision of time, when his uncle Josiah brings him, quote, the fever medicine when he had been sick from a long time ago, end quote. Teo has lost touch with the Laguna language of his mother. So just as he thinks about his, just as he's about to make sense of the lost meaning in her voice, quote, the voice suddenly broke into a language he could not understand. In other words, he has this understanding of Laguna language taught to him by his mother, but it's receding rapidly in the background of English and his exposure to Japanese language during World War II. Silko's jumbled portrayal in the mind of Teo depicts a variety of sources for his psychological disablement that underscores the precarity of Native American lives. The defining nature of precarity that surfaces in my explication of the Butlerian dual formula of dependency on others and the revelation that interdependency often results in vulnerability to harm rather than care underscores the novel's navigation of Teo's search to find reliable traditions to interpret in his own contemporary condition through which the disability stakes in ceremony are established. Thus, Silko's protagonist finds himself subject to symptoms vaguely diagnosed under the pathologizing category of battle fatigue from his white doctors at the VA hospital in which the military deposits him. But Silko offers up an alternative diagnosis, end quote. Every day, the native people living on the Laguna Reservation, had to look at the land from horizon to horizon, and every day the loss was with them. It was the dead unburied and the mourning of the loss of going on forever. Teo's ailment is the product of the chronic effects of the originary conquest of US settler colonialism that actively sought the dispossession of native indigenous people from the land by European militaries and settlers who ultimately sequester native peoples within the reservation boundaries and lead them to pass the time away waiting for it to end. So there's kind of this miasma, this pall that has settled on the contemporary Native community with which Teo interacts. And Silko means the novel to ring out as that kind of cross-generational, trans-historical malaise that has entered from the time of colonialism. Thus, when Teo wakes up in a Los Angeles hospital beneath a veil of white smoke that is the product of over-medication and nauseating trauma from memories of the death of his brother on the battlefield, both of these symptoms need to be recognized as only immediate, precipitating developments of dislocation in the present of Teo's post-war experience. Ultimately, they hide a much longer disablement that is the result of indigenous dispossession by Euro-American removals and genocidal tactics from the 15th century onward in the Americas. Disability in the present, both its impairing effects and the alternative navigations that it calls forth, is the long offshoot of the violence of colonialism from 4 centuries prior. Silko's ceremony situates its primary plot much closer to a post-World War II present. A substantial portion of Teo's PTSD treatment is oriented around revelations of the slowly dying indigenous techniques of animal husbandry in a land where native peoples have been dumped to die. The Laguna Reservation exists on non-arable, drought-ridden land that will not support cattle and whose size diminishes over the years. For instance, at a place the white loggers called North Top, the reservation land was, quote, but a small portion of the mountain. The rest of the land had been taken by the National Forest and by the state, which later sold it to white ranchers, end quote. You can see kind of the breach of treaties even around the disposal of disabled people onto reservations in the US in that comment. To feed the loggers in such a distant location, logging companies hire full-time hunters who, quote, take 10 or 15 deer each week and 50 wild turkeys in 1 month, end quote. Thus, we see this pattern of extraction of resources from the wilderness taken to excess in each instance, and as the food requirements of the humans are met, the place's resources dwindle and die, particularly those that have served for centuries as the sustainability of Native American communities. The mass slaughter of non-human animals leads to the failing health and disability of the indigenous communities who have depended on these resources to sustain themselves. Europeans arrive and rout the land at levels that can only result in further migration to a new location with resources that can be plundered in turn. Teo learns the lesson of the devastating effects of neglect and wanton killing of the non-human animal world in numerous scenes. During his childhood, Josiah comes home to find that Teo has swatted hundreds of flies to their death in a pile on the kitchen table before him. In response, Josiah tells him of how the green bottle fly once saved the community from a pattern of neglect that they had fallen into. Quote, the animals disappeared, the plants disappeared, and no rain came for a long time. People make mistakes. The flies know that. That's how the first green bottle fly came around, end quote. Similarly, Teo grows attentive to the livelihoods of grasshoppers in their, quote, bright green color of the spring. He looked down at the weeds and grass and stepped carefully by pushing the toe of his boot into the weeds first to make sure the grasshoppers were gone. And then, quote, he wanted to catch a grasshopper and hold it close to his face, to look at its big flat eyes and shiny thin legs with stripes of black and brown like beadwork, making tiny, intricate designs. The last time he held one, Rocky was with him, and they had stained their fingertips brown with the tobacco juice the grasshoppers spit, end quote. In each of these commonplace examples of the care of non-human animals, the context of wider, more devastating destruction of the land in history awaits to be uncovered. Thus, Silko documents the collapse of entire ecosystems from the 17th century onward, settler colonialist infiltration of North America as the slaughters gain momentum and reach Holocaust proportions in indigenous, non-human animal and human populations. All these works operate from all of these works of resistance literature operate from the historical origins of these environmental devastations in reverse to recognize an investment in the well-being of even the smallest creatures as a pathway to staving off future decimation of the environment. Excuse me. The next section is called Collecting the Survivors and Recording the Dead. One of the centerpieces of Silko's novel involves the admission that white people did not bring Holocaust to the shores of the Americas on their own. Rather, at the center of the novel, Silko writes of the pre-contact competition of witch ceremonies in Native American communities that underwrite her concept that indigenous peoples, quote, invented white people. It was Indian witchery that made white people in the first place. Thus, the novel foregrounds the necessity of an acceptance of responsibility that is not a simple victimization at the hands of one less powerful people by a more powerful civilization. To do so would strip indigenous people of agency and essentially underscore the claim to superiority, at least in terms of conquest, to which colonialism aspires. Rather than accept that binary premise, all of these works foreground the fact that two civilizations attempt to read and effectively navigate the otherness of the alternative culture with whom it comes in contact. The agency of which Silko's novel speaks unravels in the strange encounters that first contact initiates. But while Teo struggles to regain his health and divest himself of the sickness of unknown origins that accosts his well-being, he learns to integrate his experience of psychological and physical destruction as part of an alternative navigational map that disability affords. In other words, works of resistance literature share the tactic of deploying disability as more than the symptomatic evidence of colonial destruction. Instead, they help to elucidate Butler's argument that precarity involves the critical revelation that human worlds are created in interdependencies and that our lives are dependent on others to survive. Indigeneity offers a key opportunity to understand the revelation of dependency among native and indigenous worlds that are already based on recognitions of interdependency and thus are better positioned than their European and American invaders to recognize what we have called elsewhere the capacities of incapacity. The most important example of this alternative value of disability as precarity and the real stakes of the alternative navigations it requires into the future is contained in our earlier citation of Teo's Uncle Josiah's plan for the development of a new breed of Mexican cattle. While Mexican cattle possess the undesirable qualities of less meat and longer legs, thus making their productivity for human consumption less valuable, Josiah recognizes that these disabling qualities are exactly what is needed to breed cattle in the non-cattle sustaining desert lands of the southwestern reservation. While English imported Herefords produce fat and meat in greater quantities, thus making each animal a subject of violence to fill corporate grocery counter shelves, Joseph's design is to breed against these qualities. Quote, Herefords would not look for water. When a windmill broke down or a pool went dry, Teo had seen them standing and waiting patiently for the truck or wagon loaded with water, or for riders to herd them to water. If nobody came and there was no snow or rain, then they died there, still waiting. But these Mexican cattle were different. Josiah's revelation is to cultivate a breed more renegade and akin to the cattle that had successfully grazed these lands for centuries prior to the creation of the border in the southwestern area of the U.S. to block the regular traffic of Mexica and before that Native American people who used that passage back and forth through California up to Alaska as a trading pathway and as the shifting migration of cultures. Rather than stand passively waiting for water to come to them, Mexican cattle run and break the boundaries of the cattle ranch in an agential search for water. Their renegade existence also ignores state and national boundaries and proceed into land previously settled by Mexica people and other indigenous populations. Their inclination is towards self-preservation and a thwarting of the will of the white cattle rancher, who seeks a more docile and thus subservient species with which to contend. Their vulnerability drives them. Their precarity proves the creative force that results in alternative navigations. And their indigeneity on ancestral lands determines new evolutionary forms of existence. What appears as the basis of an abjected Western primitivism undergirded by inbuilt biological incapacity, i.e., aesthetic and functional non-normativity, proves an adaptive quality where shared precarity results in innovations of survival through new amalgams of care. Josiah's alternative breed echoes Teo's own non-normative orientation toward the world, in that disparate characteristics turn out to be advantages to avoid perishing. Teo's fever and sense of numbness that began the novel cannot be cured, but ultimately come to be valued as survival mechanisms of the effects of the persistent violence of colonialism. The protagonist travels through Galveston, New Mexico, for example, and counts all of the unemployed and disabled Indians he sees on the streets and sidewalks among the urban blight. Yet, given the degree of destruction that filial networks have suffered in the wake of colonialism, Teo does not reject these lives, but rather collects them in his imagination as those who survive alongside himself. Their mutual ability to survive in squalor represents lives who refuse to become yet another possible candidate for the human detritus pile of colonialism. He explains his vision of belonging to the horde of outcast Indians to his stepfather Robert in the following manner. I saw Navajos in torn old jackets standing outside the bars. There were Zunis and Hopis there too, even a few Lagunas. This is us too, I was thinking to myself, these people crouching outside bars like cold flies stuck to the wall, end quote. Teo's revelation of the continuance of an us functions as an epiphany to save himself from the pathologization of the malaise he experiences. Rather than ruin, Teo comes to read himself and other dispossessed people as fashioning themselves into an alternative breed that continue to survive the onslaught. Conclusion. Silko's historical resistance literature rewritings of the precariousness of indigenous people under Western colonialism forwards disability as a reliable guide to the revelation of the falsities of a nation's self-serving stories of conquest, adventure, and the rapine of indigenous people. These sensorially, psychologically, and/or physically scarred figures ground Butler's theory of precarity in that they help to underscore the racial interdependency of embodied lives. Yet, whereas Butler leaves her theory largely as a marker of the ravages of vulnerability and the foundation stone of her argument about ungrievable lives, Silko's novel also turns on the ironies of precarious, indigenous, disabled lives as vehicles of potential transformation for the insights that attention to vulnerable embodies entail. Rather than westernized, masculinist, cis hetero independence, each subject's reliance on and rejection of the mortality dealing actions of colonial others operates as the difference engine of an alternative map of ethical existence that might lead to a more sustainable hybrid indigeneity. Ceremony offers visions out of the refuse of Western colonialist despoliations of the environment for humans and non-humans alike, that which disability studies and environmental theorist Sonora Taylor refers to as dead meat capitalism. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'll be available for questions and comments in the afterword of the conference's collection. Goodbye.